Hello, my name is Piero Miceli and I'm an environment artist and generalist at Paper City. And in this tutorial, I'll be showing you my techniques to create a quick environment, and I will be going over what tools I use to do so. We'll be using Cinema 4D S24 because that is the version that we've been working with in production and have not been able to upgrade. So here we're gonna start with first opening up the scene and getting everything set up. So here's the scene that I have prepared, and it has a bunch of assets, and we're gonna start from a flat plane first, but of course what you see here are all the assets and deformers I have pre-prepared for the purposes of this tutorial. What we have here is just a pack of assets that I'll be using to create the environment. Most of the time, these come from our modeling department. So our first step is to get rid of everything and start with a flat plane. And we'll keep these extra pieces of geometry you see here alongside the plane. These are just, I've used a spline and an extrude to get that effect, and we'll be using them later to get a layered paper effect. I'll be showing you step by step how to do that. So starting from a green plane, we'll be adding a green material. So we will first duplicate our ground plane, and then we will open up a bool to use to create the layers of paper that we need. So this is the very first step. We're gonna grab these pieces of geometry and put them inside the bool and perform an intersection operation with the plane that we've duplicated and translated above the original plane. So once the operation is done, this is the result we get. We're gonna add the lime material to differentiate this layer of grass that we've cut out from the duplicated plane. Now we can move this around. This is very non-destructive. We're keeping all the geometry we have. And we can of course duplicate it and place it again inside the bool so we get multiples. This is of course to speed up our process and is part of this first step in creating our environment. Now we can duplicate the bool and perform the same thing with the other planes and add a different color. Now this is a quick way of adding basically different colored layers of grass, of paper with different shapes very quickly, and making sure that we can move them around later if needed. I will also be going over a different technique on how to create these, especially with deformed geometry. Say if the plane that we're working on is not necessarily flat, I can show you that as well. And I'll be going over a different technique on how to create these cutouts of grass and layering them onto our ground plane. So here I have the displacer deformer ready. This is the second step of creating the base layer, the ground of our environment. Now we're putting the displacer underneath the cutout geometry that's inside the bool, and that is so it can match, it can kind of add a bit of variation to the ground, and we have here the cutouts that are displaced with the displacer, but we need to also remember to copy this displacer and add it to our original ground plane so everything lines up and nothing looks weird. So this is what we're gonna do. First we add it to the other green planes. Now we've added it to our original ground plane, and it lines up, but not in all of them. I believe this is a pivot issue, but of course we will, to save time, we'll just jump to another technique right here where we can basically get the same effect, but by using a wrap deformer. This is another deformer that's very useful, and we can basically layer pieces of geometry just like we did with the lime colored ones. We're gonna use this technique to layer some dark green ones. So first we're gonna create it completely differently from, we're not gonna use a spline this time, we're gonna use a plane, and we're gonna kind of box model it and subdivide it to get a similar look to the spline generated card cutouts that we've layered there in the lime color. So here we're just tweaking the subdivisions of the default plane, and we'll be extruding some edges to get a bit of shape variation, and we'll get something that's fairly similar to the planes that we've already placed there. Now we're using the shortcut KL to access the edge loop insert tool, and we're holding Control and moving and translating the edges that were selected to extrude them. Now once we're happy with the shape, we can throw in a subdivision surface group, which will give us this effect. It will round the edges up, add a bunch of subdivisions. And with this, now we can go through what we're going to do to make this piece of plane stick to the deformed surface. And we're going to use a wrap deformer, a shrink wrap deformer, I believe, if I remember correctly. We're going to add it here. And now once we've basically parented the shrink wrap deformer to this piece of geometry, we can select what piece of geometry we want our card cutout to stick to. We're gonna of course choose the ground plane, and now to get the right effect, we just need to move it around a bit. There you go, that's to avoid any issues. And of course you see there's a lot of intersection here. We're gonna be fixing that traditionally just by selecting a few vertices and lifting this piece of geometry up a bit to make sure that it does not intersect with our original ground plane. Now of course to do so we need to bake it down, so we press C and we can translate it a bit. We can hold Alt and click on the little arrows of the translate Y box to get small incremental translations. And now we're jumping into vertex mode, and we can move the vertices around. Now to do it quickly, we want to jump into the and enable the soft selection of our translate tool. And we can tweak the radius to get a larger effect. And we can start lifting this piece of card up a little bit. This is more tedious, but this is also a bit more precise. So I'm just going over all the the green intersections that you see here, trying to get rid of them. Now once we're done, we can then assign our material where we said we were going to do dark green. And this looks pretty okay, but of course we want to have a flat surface where our characters are going to be. This is to facilitate animation. We're going to use, as you see here, a spherical field. This will be affecting the displacer deformer that we've put down on our ground planes. Now this is the third step of what I would be doing usually. This is to just ensure that from a practical standpoint, the animators have an easier time animating the characters and the surface is not as bumpy. So what we see here is the effect of the spherical field. The spherical field is set to be inverted, so it nullifies the effect of the displacer wherever the spherical field is placed. We can change the shading mode, of course, to get a better view of what is happening. This looks good. And to go over the displacer quickly, this is just a noise texture that we're plugging into the displacer deformer. These all come with the deformer itself, I believe, and we just tweak the strength. We can tweak a few settings inside the nose. We will not be going over these. These are mostly like trial and error, see what works. And until you get the desired result, there are no rules. Now we're gonna go through another step of my process, which is placing a quick background set of geometry to cover our bases to make sure there's no weird empty spaces. And for this, as you can see, I have prepared a few pieces of geometry here. They're flat, very simple, and they'll be scattered around the ground, this environment here. And we'll be using a circle spline on the cloner to do so. So here we have the circle spline that I've placed here. I'm going to unhide it. And then we can use the cloner to scatter these around. So we're going to choose object mode for the cloner and select the spline. And this is what we get if we plug in also a random and a push apart node to the cloner to get a bit of variation. Now this is again plugging these in and experimenting with some of the settings. So of course we have a bit of randomness in the scale, rotation, and so on. This is what it would look like originally if we did nothing but plug the cloner into the spline and of course have the mountain geometry underneath the cloner. But with the random, this is of course randomizing the position, scale, and the push apart is just making sure we avoid clipping in between these pieces, flat pieces of geometry, at least as much as we can. We can't always avoid it. But from the ground view, this looks fine. We might need to translate these pieces of geometry down a little bit to avoid having empty spaces. So we're gonna select the cloner and go into the transform tab and translate in the Y. I'm gonna translate down. There, we want to avoid empty spaces such as this. At eye level, this looks fine. So we are almost done there with our environment. This is the very base start of it, and we can later on move to adding actual vegetation. Now we can split our view to get our shot cam on the left, or what would be our shot cam, and then a typical viewport to which we can work in on the right side. So we're going to unhide the jungle pack that we had prepared earlier. Now this is a pack I would get from our asset library. These assets are made by our modeling department. And these are going to be instanced with the scatter brush, so I am going to move them out of the way. So here we are. And we can drag these assets into the scatter brush. We'll go over the settings now. So we can increase, of course, the radius. This will define where, in what radius and how big the circle is, where the stuff that we want to scatter is going to get scattered or instanced. Now, of course, the count, that involves how many assets are being scattered on a specific brushstroke. And if we go into the object properties, here we can randomize rotation range and, for example, the position and scale randomization. This will be happening as we place a brushstroke. All of this stuff, all of these parameters will affect how things are being instanced. So let's try a few settings here. We're going to be randomizing mostly rotation and scale. I don't usually change the position. That is usually randomized quite well from the get-go. And we can select a few assets here and drag them into our object palette. Now we don't use selection, we use object palette because it's easier to manage. We can start painting. This is not gonna look good from the get-go. Of course, this will take a bit of trial and error. In fact, the flowers here are too big. So we're gonna go through tweaking the scale first and foremost. Now we can do that in the source asset here. There we go. So we can use our global scale, and of course, since the objects are being instanced, they will react to whatever modification is made to the original object. Now that we have adjusted the scale a little bit, we can continue tweaking and refining the settings of our scatter brush until we get the desired effect. So if here the rotation range, and perhaps we can tweak the radius a bit. Of course, scale is our main concern, as we saw earlier. Maybe 100. Or 135, we will see what works. Now object spacing will affect, it sort of creates a bounding box around each object that's being instanced in. It's that red circle you see around every instance. And that will define how close these red circles can get to each other. So of course it defines the object spacing, as it says, between each asset that's getting scattered. We're happy with this result, and we can start painting happily. A few flowers around our characters. Now, of course, we have the shotgun there on the left, but the camera is going to be moving around quite often in this environment, so we know we have to scatter stuff around the characters, not just where the shotgun is showing. We can, of course, quickly switch out our assets. That's why we use the object palette. It's less confusing than using the selection option. And here we want to make sure that we work, with the same scatter that we have created. The scatter is a group that will hold all the instances that we are painting with the scatter brush. Now here, if we use the same scatter we created for the flowers for these bushes, the scatter brush will know not to spawn any bushes where there are already flowers. This will avoid any clipping. We're tweaking the settings again. Of course, for every asset it's going to be different. And the nice thing is that with the scatter brush, we can of course work on any kind of surface. It makes it so that every object that's being scattered sticks to the surface it's being painted on. And this is a very quick way of getting some geometry down. And we can actively choose where to put it. And this of course curates the creation of our environment a lot better than relying solely on a cloner, for example. There's also, I believe, a more artist-friendly way of working. But of course, cloners do have their uses, as we saw earlier. They're an excellent way of laying down some geometry very, very quickly. Now we're going to go through adding some trees. We can drag these into our object palette in the scatter brush. And again, the settings are going to be different. We want a bit more rotation in the trees. We can start placing them down. Now we want the trees to be quite dense, so a bit of tweaking in the object spacing should do that. This looks okay. And of course, again, we want to make sure that we work in the original scatter that we created for the flowers and the bushes, and this will help us avoid any clipping. As you can see here, as my brush strokes go over the bushes, no palm trees are being spawned, and this is very nice to avoid any clipping. So we will continue until we are happy with the result we're getting. This is pretty much the final step of what I would do to create an environment, of course. In production, usually I would take a lot longer to, decide where to place stuff, what assets to use, and I would of course curate this a lot more, but for the purposes of this tutorial, this is more than enough. But thank you very much for listening to this tutorial. I hope it was helpful. Thank you so much.